found over the years that stories from our history are oftentimes skewed or altered, or in my case, forgotten over time, making it difficult to remember the actual truth. I mean, I remember some names and maybe some abstract plots from history class, but if I was to be graded on anything in depth, I'd ultimately fail. Unless the quiz was about like the lyrics to Eminem's Without Me from 16 years ago that I learned when I was like 14, then I'd ace. You ever wondered why it was so much easier to remember things through music, through song? They say assigning notes and pitches to words made them easier to remember and to recall. For instance, twinkle, twinkle, little star, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And now I'm up to my knee. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a patella to me. We're doing the bone dance underneath. No. I'll stop myself. Music and history have always been intermingled together, and yet we are never taught history this way. The stories that we learned directly affected music of this time, and yet the music and art directly affected history itself. The choices and the values of people during this time created these traditions and yet also innovated them as well. Here's what I mean by innovated, is that you're creating something new using something old. For instance, you're listening to the radio and you swear you recognize that melody line, those lyrics are a song that you used to know. They're copying, they're sampling, here come the lawsuits, nothing is original anymore, am I right? I mean, yeah, because we've been stealing stuff for centuries. I mean, Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, they were stealing stuff from before they were born. Renaissance music was stealing from the ancient Greeks. Jazz players were using stuff from Debussy, and rap music, yeah, those are 13th century motets. I mean, you have to put a new twist on the old, because otherwise we would not have pop music after World War II ended. Going to see your favorite artist in concert is still a relatively new concept. Understanding how music came into existence and is where it is today can only be answered historically. To avoid sounding like some boring history class, I'm putting my own twist on it. I'm innovating. So welcome to the first episode of His-Music-Tory, or music and history in my own words. If we're going to talk about the history of music, we're going to have to go back. I mean, like way back. And you may be like, ooh, classical music. And I'm like, no, Neanderthal. I'm talking Paleolithic and Mesolithic and Neolithic and other lithics that I can't think of. I'm talking Stone Age. You got your bows and arrows and farming and all these cave people that left fossils and artifacts and cave drawings so we know how they lived. And that is how music comes in. So scientists were able to find bones, like carved into flutes and whistles, and there were pictures of guys playing drums. And then we move into the Bronze Age, and hello weapons, hello the wheel, you get metal instruments. There were even pictures of stringed instruments, but none of them survived because that was forever ago. But the biggest problem why we know nothing about their music is that there were no records of anything. Nothing was written down. Why? Because there was no such thing as writing, just pictures on the wall in a cave. This is where everything changed. In the great land of Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, aka Iraq today. And you definitely learned this in school because this is where cuneiform was born. This is where civilization started. Because apparently we weren't civilized until we started writing stuff down. But it wasn't until Mesopotamia that we invented beer, so maybe that's the real reason why we're now civilized. I mean, we had to honor the goddess of beer, so drink we must, right? So people started writing on tablets. They were using these like wedgie looking symbols and what looked like a Rosetta Stone, and started talking about their life. And it went viral. this, along with pictures and artifacts, we were able to learn more about what music was like back then. They found lyres and harps in the tombs of royals. Only the elite could play, write, and draw about their lives, of course. So the oldest written story is that of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which Gilgamesh might sound familiar to you. It was like a book I had to read in high school about like this asshole king who they sent an assassin down to come kill him because he was being a dick, and then they became friends. And then the king was upset and like whining about mortality when his dude friend dies, and so he goes off on an adventure to go find immortality, and then he goes through all these things and he fucks up, and the gods are like pitying him, and so they're like, hey, if you get this plant, then you will live forever. And so he goes off, finally gets a plant, and then the snake comes and steals it, and so he just has to go home with no plant, no immortality, and he has to like live his life forever to death. I actually don't really remember this story, and I think that's right, and there's probably a moral to the story, like, don't be a dick, but honestly, I can't remember, because high school was over 10 years ago now. Again, only the elite could play, write, and draw. So the rich boys, sorry ladies, play for events like you would today. They play for weddings and funerals, dances, playing for the kids, honoring the gods. Down in Babylon, things are changing. During this time, they're erecting their Tower of Babel, which was like a big fuck you tower to God because of the Great Flood. But they also started writing too. They had always passed everything by word of mouth, like a verbal Yelp page. But they're going more into depth about their types of songs, how they performed and improvised, and even how they tuned their instruments. And from these writings, that's how we got our diatonic scales. Yeah, Babylon even went further and started to notate their own music. We actually have an artifact that is the oldest and most complete form of notated music from back then, which is amazing. But as you can see, it is extremely hard to read even for experts. Because most music back then was either memorized or improvised, so it's not exact. Think of it as a recipe to a cook. It's a way to replicate the music, but it's not an exact match. While writing everything down made things easier for people in that city because they could go read about the law versus someone telling them about it, it wasn't like it spread worldwide. Yeah, writing showed up in India and China and Egypt, but it wasn't uniform, so there wasn't a lot left behind by them, and so a lot about their music was lost in translation. But in walks ancient Greece. And comparatively, they seem to have their shit together. I mean, they were writing stuff down too, but on clay pots instead of tablets. But they actually described how they played their flutes and lyres. Like, they had some instruments you may not have heard of. The aloes was this double pipe thing that threw some love at the goddess of fertility and wine. Funny how those go together. The lyres usually accompanied tellings of Homer stories. I mean, this Homer, not that Homer. But you could also play the lyre for like a wedding or for fun. And the kithara was this giant lyre that was used to play in the theater. So musicians started to play solo. They would actually compete against each other and actually get famous from it. They were making the music like tricky and showy, and they would get this following, and like thousands of people would show up to see them play. And some of the musicians actually started making money by touring and playing for rich people. And then the other musicians, like the women and the slaves, the low status, they would get excluded. Now, when the Greeks were writing about music, it was split into two different things: actual music theory and what they thought music was capable of doing. Do any of these guys sound familiar? Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoras, Aristides. Maybe not that last one. So Plato was the one that basically built a school and spilled all the tea on Socrates.
The only true wisdom consists in knowing that you know nothing.
Aristotle said, hey, the earth is the center of the universe, not the sun. And dolphins are sea mammals, not fish. Pythagoras was the guy that was forced upon you in math class with the a squared plus b squared equals you can use a ruler. And Aristides wrote a book. But Socrates legit called him out on his shit as a student. And Plato's just sitting there like, well, I guess it's going to be a new chapter in my book. I mean, yes. So all these dudes, philosophers, started writing about how music was influencing Western culture. Cool. So some of the thoughts that they expressed, for instance, were gods and demigods, of course, invented music, whether for art or science, and was in all aspects of Greek life. Now give me a word, any word, and I'll tell you how the root of that word is Greek. Okay, how about melody? Melos, coming from the Greek word meaning member or part of a whole. So melody, part of a song.
There you go.
Now Greek music is monophonic, like a single melody line. Kind of like when you were a little kid playing on the piano with like one hand. So they would play the lyre like that, and then they would sing. But we don't know whether it was heterophony or polyphony with the music or against the music. A perfect melos had to have a cornucopia of song, text, and dance. So basically, boy bands were the ultimate perfect melos. Am I right? We also got other musical terms from their writings, like lyrics comes from poems slapping the lyre, and odes were from singing hymns, and harmonia means part of an orderly whole, just like a harmony line fits in perfectly with a melody line. Now remember Pythagoras, the theorem guy? He shockingly was obsessed with math and numbers and ratios, and he actually came up with what is now known as octaves, fourths, and fifths. Yeah, he did something else other than a theorem. Ptolemy, yes, another dude that thinks the Earth is the center of the universe, believed that the planets moving around in space could make the sound that we couldn't hear, called the harmony of the spheres, or the music of the spheres. You have all these planets revolving around suns, and those suns are revolving around in a galaxy, and all those galaxies revolving around each other. And if you take those gravity patterns and feed them through the TARDIS harmonic filter, that is the sound of the universe.
Because the music of the spheres is all around you.
Everyone loved the idea of the planets making their own kind of music. Even Shakespeare and Johannes Kepler, who believed maybe, just maybe, the sun is the center of the universe. Remember, Greece was all about theory and how music affects you. So they believed that music affects your ethos, your inner harmonia, or in other words, your character, your soul. So Aristotle said that if you mimic the emotion, you would feel it. Just like when you're sad and you listen to a sad song on purpose to become even more sad. Most people believed you went to the gym to work your body and then you use music to work your mind. Within reason. If you listened to too much music, then you were weak and mean. And if you went to the gym too much, then you were dumb and uncivilized. Most importantly, traditions should not be changed for fear of the aftermath. Governments saw this as a form of anarchy if you strayed away from convention. The shock alone of the emergence of ragtime, jazz, rock and roll, and even punk shows a true testament of these deep-seated beliefs in what we hold as heritage.
A contributing factor to our juvenile delinquency of today. The evil feeling that you feel when you sing it. If you talk to the average teenager of today and you ask them what it is about rock and roll music that they like, the beat.
So back to theory. Rhythm, that thing that you realize that your friend does not have when you put them on rock band drums, actually comes from how they said and sang their poems. They would emphasize their words in specific ways so that we can agree that melody has notes and intervals set within a specific scale, and out pops the Greek tetrachord, which is 4 notes set in a fourth. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. I cannot sing.
Who can these days?
What does Beethoven, Ray Charles, Green Day, NSYNC, Michael Jackson, the Beatles, and Christmas carols have in common? No clue? The Andalusian cadence, the diatonic Phrygian tetrachord. It's a musical sequence that everyone has used and you've definitely heard. And the Greeks started it. Take a listen.
I love the colorful clothes she wears and the way the sunlight plays upon her head.
Ultimately, one of the coolest things about keeping receipts on history is things survive. We have almost 45 pieces of music from Greek times. And there are words with music notated above them, not unlike music of today. One of the oldest transcribed songs that is the most complete is called the Epitaph of Cyclos, and it was found on a tombstone in Turkey. Here's what the tombstone looked like versus a transcription made in modern notation. We don't know what it sounded like, but here's a clip of what it could have sounded like. I know, you're tired of hearing about Greece. I get it. How about Rome? Gladiators, blood, guts, gore, and glory.
Are you not entertained?
Sorry. We're about 500 years too early, because Rome was just founded, and Rome has now absorbed Greece into one of its provinces, which means it's totes cool to jack Greece's swag as its own, which means that they too agree that melody comes from how you say it. You should memorize music and not quite write it, and that music goes hand in hand with nature, science, and theory. Greek music starts ghosting on the world entirely until medieval times, when Baroque music and Renaissance music uses elements of Greek to create new subgenres, like operas and tragedies. But that's for another episode. Rome eventually gets this new emperor named Augustus, right? And he wants to beautify the city with art and music, but he was a trendsetter, because up until now, Romans would dye their hair black because blondes were associated with sex workers and French and German slaves. But in walks hot new blonde emperor, and the rest was history. Okay, so some fun facts about Augustus, right? Julius Caesar was his great uncle and actually adopted him. His sister up and married his mortal enemy, whose name is Mark Antony. He later kicked out his daughter, his own daughter, because she was sleeping around with a bunch of dudes, including his mortal enemy's son, which is kind of like her first cousin, right? And all of his heirs mysteriously died when they were young, except for like little old Tiberius. But I guess a lot of people liked him because the next 5 emperors were all related to him. Greek music has subsided and disappeared, and thus all good things must come to an end. The Roman Empire peaked and soon began imploding on itself under the weight of its new size. But again, I'm sorry. We're still like 100 years away from gladiator levels of violence, but in due time. But for now, this chapter is closed. Thank you so much for watching episode 1 of His-Music-Tory, or Music in History in my own words. Please let me know in the comments below if you would like to see episode 2. Bye!